Hello, everyone. Welcome to the School of Visual Arts. We're very fortunate this evening to have Professor Deniz Beyazit with us. And I'm going to read a little bit about Deniz because her credentials are quite wonderful and very impressive. Dr. Deniz Beyazit is Assistant Curator in the Department of Islamic Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, where she specializes in medieval Islamic and Ottoman art and architecture. A graduate of the Sorbonne, she has been a research associate at both the Museum Reitberg in Zurich and the French Institute for Anatolian Studies in Istanbul, as well as the Kahlili Research Center in Oxford. She has taught at the University of Zurich and since 2005 has been involved in cultural heritage and restoration projects in southeastern Turkey. Dr. Beyazit is the editor of At the Crossroads of Empires, 14th through 15th Century Eastern Anatolia, de Bukhard, 2012 publishers, and the publication of her dissertation on Artikid architectural decoration of the 12th through the 15th century in southeast Turkey is forthcoming from the British Archaeological Reports of Oxford. Her current research focuses on medieval palaces of the Jazeera and depictions of Mecca in Ottoman art. At the Metropolitan, where she has worked since 2010, Dr. Beyazit helped with the expansion and restructuring project of the Galleries for Islamic Art, which reopened in 2011. Among her many projects, she organized the exhibitions The Making of a Collection, Islamic Art at the Met, that was in 2011-2012, and Carpets of the East and Paintings from the West, 2014 at the Met and 2015 at the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. Together with her colleagues Sheila Canby and Martina Rjadi, she is preparing the exhibition and accompanying publication, Court and Cosmos, The Great Age of the Seljuqs, which is to open on the 27th of April of this year. Please join me in giving Deniz a very warm welcome to the School of Visual Arts. Thank you, Deniz.
Well, thank you, Peter, for introducing me, and thank you overall for inviting me to give this talk, which I hope will raise some interest on medieval Islamic art. And I'm very grateful to the School of Visual Arts, and particularly to Tom Hahn, I hope I pronounced correctly, as well as to Justin Elm, who helped with to set up the PowerPoint presentation. So what I brought you today is a selection of images of very beautiful artworks, which at the beginning of April will all arrive individually to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and will be installed then in the exhibition, the special exhibition gallery, which we call the Cantor Gallery. And after 4 weeks of busy installation, the exhibition will open to the public on April 27. So before I start with the slides, I just want to give a few introductory remarks on that period about which we will be talking and about which these artworks will illustrate, like the magnificence of culture, of art, of craftsmanship in the regions of Iran, Central Asia, Anatolia, and also a bit Syria and Iraq. Chronologically, we are talking about a period that goes from the early 11th to the late, or I would say to the early 14th century. And in certain areas, we would even go to the very end of the 14th century. So it's quite a large stretch in geography, and as well as in chronology. We're covering almost 300 years, and a distance that goes from Merv, that's today in Turkmenistan, to Isfahan in Iran, to places such as Mosul, Damascus, Aleppo, which you may know now because of the sad news of the ongoing war in the Near East. And then further north and further west to Anatolia, to cities like Konya, Erzurum, Sivas, and other places. So it's quite a broad, thematically very broad, and the material is very rich. So there are several ways to present the material to the public, not only to the public, but as you know, at the Met, we always try to have a scholarly approach and also present the material to the scholars. So it's not a typical art historical exhibition. We could have divided this in periods and say, let's do first Iran, Central Asia, and then move chronologically forward to Syria, Iraq, and Anatolia, which is now to Turkey. So instead of doing that classical approach, we decided to do something different, to have themes that highlight aspects of the daily life of these people. Of course, many of the artworks rather come from a courtly context or are believed to be made for wealthier people, but still there is also some popular material. And so the idea was to reflect, to try to tell the story of the life at the court, the life in the streets, etc. So So just to give you an idea about the region we're talking about. So I'm sorry, this is a scan of the catalog that just has finished with printing and binding. And so you see the density of the places, of the cities from that time in those areas. We have talking about Anatolia, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and then further we're going until Afghanistan. That was also part of the great Seljuk world. So we're really in one of the most glorious periods. It's for Iran and for Anatolia, it's one of the golden ages. I mean, myself being from Turkey, I can tell you, even if I talk to somebody in the street, everybody will know about the Seljuks. Completely different here. If I go in the street and say, well, I'm doing an exhibition on the Seljuks, nobody will understand. But in Turkey or in Iran, everybody will know because it's the glory of the past. For Turkey, it's a time when the Turkish culture was introduced to the lands, to the Anatolian lands, which in our days correspond more or less to the Republic of Turkey. And so that's why. It's very simple. Well, just to show you some images about the material. So there was clearly an economic boom in Iran and also in Central Asia after the beginning of the Seljuk rule. And the result was, of course, an increase in craftsmanship, but also like existing techniques such as brass that was inlaid, a technique that was known already since ancient times. They tested, and the aim was really to have much more sophisticated artworks, which led to things like this famous Glockenspiel that will be traveling from the British Museum in London. There were also new inventions and new techniques in ceramics. New shapes were created, and specifically there was a new material, stone paste material, that was much harder and on which they tried relief decoration, and shapes from China and Central Asia were imitated. And then also they invented new glazes. So there are two very important new glazes that are known for the Islamic world in general. One is luster ceramics and the other is Minai ceramics, which is very colorful. Minai is, we call it also like the technique of the 7 colors. It's a bit like painting, very colorful, and it's actually very difficult to produce on the body of stone paste or of ceramics because it has to go several times in the oven and it's very delicate, so the risk that it breaks is very high. But so those techniques, they developed and flourished under the Seljuqs, first in Iran. There was one very important ceramic center in Kashan, and from there the technique spread to Syria, Iraq, and also Anatolia. Then, of course, manuscripts. Manuscripts were considered as luxurious products in the medieval period, and one has to understand that there was an increase of paper production that started already in the 8th, 9th century in the Islamic world, but it was specifically under the Seljuqs in the 10th, 11th century that paper became really very popular, which led to a much larger production of manuscripts that were used to write down the Quran, the holy word of God, that would be lavishly not illustrated, like decorated with gold paint, very fine arabesque decoration. There was also a development in different styles of script. So that's another section that is characteristic for Islamic art. And again, it's in the Seljuk time that the script kind of received a special focus or emphasis. There was a very geometric script that received floral decoration, and all kind of styles developed. There is even a script that has ends of letters with animals or human heads. We call it the zoomorph script. And that script particularly developed on metalwork pieces like this one, only on metalwork pieces, and it's characteristic for the Seljuk period. Here, just to see an image of how minai looks. So that's one of the ceramics inventions. And then, of course, there was an increased activity in building and construction. And it is true that in Iran and Central Asia, where the main material was more perishable, let's say what they were using was brick and less stone, this leads to an impression that in Anatolia or Syria or Iraq, much more survived or more was constructed, but it's actually wrong. It's just a wrong impression. So here, can I go? Yeah. So that's one of the famous buildings in Anatolia, in Turkey. It's a so-called complex, a madrasa that also served as a hospital, and it's it's a UNESCO World Heritage Monument and Site, and it's just, amazing. The carved decoration that you can see here on one of the portals, I can say it's unique, but actually it's not that unique, because when you look around, then you discover more, but this is really one of the most prestigious ones. Well, so I mentioned the exhibition space, so that's how the current design looks like. I can tell you it's still work in progress. We just decided on the colors, but just to give you an idea of the scale of the space and how it's organized. So the designer decided to use the plan of a medieval Seljuk mosque, which characteristically has columns. So we have these columns here. Some of them belong to the building of the Met, so you can't move them. And usually there are walls that are built around and to separate the different spaces in an exhibition. But so this time the designer decided to keep them and actually to add more columns and to give the impression of a forest of columns, and that's something that you sometimes encounter when you go to a mosque, to a great mosque in Iran or in Turkey. It's this idea of having a hippo-style room. And so the exhibition is built around, so this is the entrance, and then it's organized in 6 sections. We have a first section around the rulers. We're trying to show artworks that can be connected with the rulers or the ruling elite. And then we come in the second section, and you see here we also have projections. All these in red on the top, these are projections. So here in the second room, this is actually quite big. That's section 2. It's about the courtly, what we call the courtly cycle. So the life at the court, the life in the palace. We'll talk about adornment, about perfumes, about clothing, but also about what were they doing, listening to music, having entertainment, reciting poetry, and so on. And then very important, there is a section on playing, like games, hunting, because these were all very favorite pastimes of the rulers and the elites, and hunting, fighting, playing backgammon. And then we enter in a different world. So up there is a section 3 that's on science, so all the technical inventions. It's also about medicine, so what kind of Greek treatises were copied. I mentioned the explosion of paper and paper production. That also led to a diffusion of knowledge through the paper. So there were more people who could read and who wanted to make available the knowledge through books. Then there is another section, and there we really enter to the special part of the Seljuk world. It's section 4. It's about astrology, magic, animals, and all kind of superstitional beliefs. There is one really, I would say, surprising aspect if you think about Islamic art in general, that is kind of non-figural or has this like etiquette to be non-figural. In the Seljuk world, it's figural. So that's why we decided we really wanted to understand what do these figures mean, because you find them everywhere, and that's why we devoted one section on figural imagery. And from there, the exhibition then ends slowly. We get into more like religious arts, like how does a mosque look like, or what elements are important in a mosque. Also the importance given to madrasas. This is an higher educational institution to teach religion, but also law, and sometimes also astronomy. And the madrasas were particularly they spread under the Seljuks because there was a real motivation to spread Sunnism versus Shiism or versus other religions, both in Iran, but also Anatolia, Syria, and Iraq. And that's why we have a lot of madrasas that remain from that period. Then in the last section is on funerary arts, and actually what you see here, this huge room, is what we call our graveyard. So we try to show tombstones, textiles that have been uncovered in tombs. We try to understand and to present how funerary practices happened. So one of the difficulties we encountered, because until now I spoke about the Seljuks in general. And I mentioned that there is this difficulty in geography because it's a broad geography, but also in chronology because it's a long history. So if you look closer, it's not just one unified empire. So they were the Great Seljuks in Iran. They were based in Iran and in Central Asia. But then they were different, let's say, Seljuk successor dynasties, but they were not, they didn't it was not a unified territory. So we have the Seljuks in Anatolia. These were cousins of the Great Seljuks in Iran, but they had a complete different sultanate. They created their own sultanate. And then together with the Great Seljuks, when they conquered Syria, Iraq, and parts of Anatolia, came these other Turkic dynasties, and there are many of them. I can tell you myself, since 15 years I'm working on this period, but I'm still confused about the history. It's really complicated. So in this exhibition, we kind of tried to, we're mentioning or we're highlighting a few of these other dynasties, but we can't highlight them all because the political situation is too complicated. That's one issue. And the other issue is that we don't have enough artworks that we could relate to all these other Turkish dynasties. So among the important ones that will be highlighted, and that's something that we try to show in these first sections, are the Rum Seljuqs in Turkey, or the Anatolian Seljuqs, the Great Seljuqs in Iran and Central Asia, and the Artukids and the Zengids, who were ruling in Syria, northern Iraq, and what's now southeastern Turkey. That region, which for ancient periods is called like Mesopotamia, that's between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And I'm just gonna quickly go back to the geographical map, just that you understand. So we're really talking about this little small region between the two rivers. That's what we call the Jazeera. That was among the most fertile, and still today it's very fertile because it has the water, and it's where today are all these dams, water dams that are built. And it was the same in the medieval period. It was a very fertile region that led to settlement very early in the time of the history. But it was also a region that was always contested. So in the Seljuk time, the Artukids and the Zengids, they managed to keep control for, let's say, between 150 to 300 years. It's quite exceptional. Even today, actually, that region is very contested. It's where you have, it's at the border with Syria, between Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. You have Kurds that are living there, you have Yazidis, you have Syriac Christians, Jews, Armenians, Muslims. It was a very, very mixed population in medieval times. This mixture about population is another aspect that is important to understand this time. It is that in Anatolia, Syria and Iraq, before the arrival of the Seljuks, the majority was Christian. So the Seljuks, and this is specifically true for Anatolia, the Seljuks also introduced Islam, but the majority was Christian. And it's very interesting because the elite intermarries with Greeks, with Armenians, with Georgians, and they have different identities. Like they are officially Muslim rulers outside, but at home they practice other rituals, or they also follow another religion. And this is one of our conclusions, that we think that's why this material is so interesting and there is so much going on with the figural iconography. So I think now we really need to go and see a bit of the art. So one of the challenges in section 1, so we have this monumental figure here, another exception for Islamic art to have monumental figural imagery. One of the challenges is that for the Great Seljuks in Iran and Central Asia, there are very, very, I would say, almost no artifacts that we can tie with specific rulers. So what we decided is we put material where we believe it comes from a palace or from a courtly setting. But except like coins or later depictions of Great Seljuk rulers, there is nothing. All the existing artifacts with Great Seljuk names are fakes. Very interesting point for the art market. So it's also with this material that appeared on the art market in the early 20th century that the fakes appeared in Islamic art. And actually, if we go back, this specific figure was a major research project in this exhibition because the pigments are all later additions. And even we are not sure if the entire body, if it's authentic or not. So now we came to the conclusion that they probably existed, these kind of figures, but we're not really clear about what was added and how much was fake and how much not. The situation is different in the western part. Under the Rum Seljuqs, we have this splendid textile that will be coming from Lyon, where we have the name of Alaaddin Keykubat I. Or we have this unique plate that comes from Innsbruck. This is really unique. I mean, you have to understand that this technique, so it's made of copper, gilded cloisonné, champ levé enamel. That does not exist in Islamic art. This is the only piece in the world that exists that has a Persian inscription here around, which gives the names and the title of Rukn al-Dawla Dawood, for whom this plate was made, who was an Artukid ruler who ruled in Hasan Keyf, Hissan Kaifa, that is now on the Tigris in southeastern Turkey. We have no idea why this plate was made. Why does it exist? Because there is nothing to compare with. Everything that we can compare with is either Byzantine, is Georgian. Some scholars even try to make a link with enamel work from Limoges, like French medieval enamel work. We still don't know. So the scholars are discussing since 250 years about this piece. So this is going to come. And you can see it's very amazing, the imagery here around. This is a depiction of the ascension of Alexander the Great, who is surrounded by birds of prey, animal combats, dancing figures. These were all like common themes that were understood both in the Islamic and in the Christian world, that were considered like as a courtly entertainment or courtly dolce vita, if you want. We have this beautiful mirror from the David collection. Then I mentioned the importance given to inlaid metalwork. So there was one very important center that was in Mosul. So Mosul, who today, you can't even look at the newspaper, it's so saddening. But in the medieval times, it was a very peaceful place. And it was a very sophisticated place where these very luxurious brasses inlaid with very fine motifs, with lots of imagery were created. Or Mosul was also known for the manuscripts. So this is just, you don't have to look at this. This is just a detail of section 2. You see it's about music and dancing, palace, lighting devices, bathing, adornment, the importance of enthronement scenes, and so on. Here I'm just showing a detail of this famous blockhouse sewer, just to give you an insight on how this metalwork works, because it's really an art in the detail. You can see how delicately this craftsman, whose name we know because he inscribed this piece here, Ibn Shuja, how delicately this seated figure holds the flute, and this other person, probably a woman, playing the harp. Each vignette on this blockhouse sewer is like that. So we have scenes of musicians. Here at the bottom you see a hunter riding on his horse. Here we have like a frieze of battle scenes, very similar to what we would expect in Greek, on a Greek Parthenon frieze. But it's Islamic. We have here the inscription, and then we have other works here and other images. There is a huge panel coming from Philadelphia. Again, this is made of stucco. We are not really sure about what exactly is authentic in this piece. So there was some analysis that was done that could highlight that parts like these figures, they were probably authentic, whereas these elephants here, they seem to be more problematic. But all in all, it gives you the idea of the importance of the enthronement scene at that time, because all the life was organized and written. That's also in the mirrors for princes that were written at that time. Everything was around the ruler, because he was the shadow of God on earth. He was the ruler of the East and the West, and he was responsible for like a peaceful life. He was responsible for prosperity, that the rivers would flow, that there was a good harvest, and he was also the judge who would decide who is right and what's not right. So he, the just and ideal ruler, who is depicted here in this very calm pose, a very typical Turkish, like a seating position with crossed legs, which we also call like the Buddha, the seated Buddha. He's seated on a cushion, usually on a simple throne with high finials. He's holding with one hand a cup, that's a drinking cup, and very often in his other hand he has a folded cloth, or what we call a mendil, that he poses upon his knee. And then around him are his attendant, like the amirs, the officers who can hold officers. So they represent his entourage. Life at the palace. Here just a few details to show some material that come from an existing palace in Konya. And then, so it's about adornment. So before you go to the scene, to the audience scene that takes place around the ruler, you have to be dressed. You will need to clean yourself, you go to the hammam, or you wash yourself, you perfume yourself, and you dress yourself with beautiful kaftans, like this one from the Sarikhani collection. Then you put on adornment, jewelry. Not only the women would wear jewelry, but also the men. And of course, similar, maybe today a bit less, but I mean, in that time, the more jewelry and the more gold and glittery, the more wealthy you would be. And so we have some very extraordinary pieces, for example, this bracelet that will come from Turkmenistan. And I have to mention, actually, it's the first time that Turkmenistan is lending to a country outside Turkmenistan. So this is a great achievement in this exhibition. Here we have other scenes of, so it's always the same motif, so you'll find it in different media. So here we have an enthronement scene in a small minai bowl, or in what we call a hub. A hub is a storage vessel that until recently, or I think still today, is made in Iraq and also in southeastern Turkey to store drinking water. And in the past, these kind of hubs, so this is just a little fragment, a top piece, so you have to imagine that this is just a third. And it was very sophisticatedly carved, as you can see. And again, what do we have? We have a seated ruler. We have his amirs on the left and right side. And here at the edge, there is, you can't really see it, that's a sphinx. That's another royal guard. In the Seljuk period, all these fantastic animals, they were alive. And you can see them in the portable arts. And then we have another royal motif, the pair of the peacocks here on top. So we have all kind of utensils of eating and drinking vessels, such as this silver bowl, which has interesting inscription that relates to drinking wine. This is a very sophisticated piece, but there are also more simpler vessels, such as this glass bottle that was made in Syria. Then this interesting combination of a spoon and a fork. That's something that we know also from the Roman period, and I don't know if in your, I mean, myself in my youth, when we would go to camp with the school, we had these folding spoons and forks. This one, I don't remember if, no, this one folds as well, but you see, I mean, it's very sophisticated. It's made of silver, has all these beautiful inscription inlaid with yellow. And some have on the back these amazing images of dragons. Then something much more simpler. This kind of bowl was very common in Syria. And so the popular people like you and me would use those for everyday eating, soup, rice. Then we have, this is a tray stand. So on top you would place like the table or like a larger plate. Again, this is made of a sophisticated material. So we know that all these inlaid brasses that are inlaid with silver and gold, those were really, that was the household of the riches, of the wealthy and of the ruling elite. So I mentioned dancing, music, hunting, and fighting. So I have to run through these images, I'm sorry, but I hope you can come and see the real works. Because then in section 3, that is quite a short section, and it's focusing on medicine, science, and technology. And in technology is specifically about the ceramics. So we have these mortars like this, that were used to grind, not only grind food and spices, but they were used to make the medicine. Then this amazing piece. When we looked in the books and I saw this little box, I just saw, okay, it is Seljuqs. Somebody attributed it to Anatolia or Iran, 11th to 13th century. And as you can see, it has here an inscription, and then it has here, each lid actually opens, and on the inside there is a little inscription. And so we tried to read the inscription with help of an epigrapher. And we figured out actually that each of these little inscriptions refers to an aromatic: kafur, camphor, musk, musk, and lakluk, which is another raisin. And at the same time, by coincidence, we didn't ask this, the people who own this piece in Stuttgart did some analysis on the little sections inside, and they found out that they were remains of ointment. So the two information, the reading of the inscription combined with the analysis, gave us the link. This was a traveling pharmaceutical box, because in the medieval time, the aromatics were used to perfume yourself, but they were also the basic ingredients to make the medicine. Musk and camphor were the two main aromatics that were used to make any kind of perfume, but also any kind of medicine. So we gave the label pharmaceutical box. Then I mentioned with the diffusion and the increase of paper production, the importance given to scientific works that are translated from Greek to Arabic or Syriac, and that were often illustrated, such as this. This is a folio that is from the Materia Medica, or this very rare book, which we call, it's named Kitab al-Diryak, the Book of Antidotes. While the first one is a very common book, and we have several copies of it, and it's also known from the Greeks. This one, we only have two in the world. One, which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, that will come to the exhibition, and another copy exists in Vienna. These two manuscripts that are lavishly illustrated, as you can see here, they talk about how to make antivenom against snake poison. So there are all kind of different stories that, a prince or a woman in the bazaar was bitten by a snake. And then there is a chapter who talks about how to make the venom, the antivenom, and how to give it to the person that was bitten by the snake. So it's very interesting. Why are there only two copies? And both are from Mosul, from the Jazeera, and about from this time, late 12th, early 13th century. We don't know. So Then there is also, in this section, all kind of instruments that helped to understand the world. It's really like the hardcore of the science, mathematics, here an astrolabe, or a globe that has, again, it's made in this typical technique of inlaid brass. And you can see that on the surface, there are all these figural depictions. These are the constellations of the stars that are depicted on the globe. So it's not the world. At that time, they still they thought that the world was flat, but it's a depiction of the sky that is applied on the globe. This is different understanding of how things function. This just helped them to understand, I mean, to see the figures, to see the stars and how they all related together. But to have this idea to put it on the globe, it's because they thought, oh, that must be round. But it was actually it's the opposite. Okay, then section 4, it's about iconography. So from this, like the real science, there is suddenly, I mean, not really suddenly, but coexisting, there is another lineage in the Seljuk world. It's these other beliefs it's about. So we have astronomy, the science of the stars, but then we have astrology, the importance to, have to believe in your astrological sign, to believe that the Sphinx will protect you, to believe that the lion, will help you to cross the street. We don't really know. I'm making this up, I have to admit, because there is no mythology there is no Seljuk mythology. It's not like in the Greek and Roman period we have Homer. We don't have Homer in the Seljuk time, but we have all these figures, and we are just trying to understand together with a few written documents and together with other existing works where we know we can attach a specific meaning. That all helps us to give some idea of how the imagery functioned. So there is one thing for sure, astrology was very important, because we always have this full cycle of the 8 planets, and at that time, and the 12 signs of the zodiacs that would surround them. So we have them, for example, here on another very famous inlaid metalwork piece that will come from London. They're all depicted here. And usually the signs of the zodiacs, they'll appear with their overlord, like here, Cancer. And then we have them here at the bottom again. Very interesting in terms of like measuring the time and like the seasons. We have uniquely in Anatolia, we have on these candlesticks the depiction of the labors of the months. That's something not very common. I mean, actually doesn't exist in Iran and Central Asia. And it's very interesting because the different signs, I don't know if you can see them, but for example here this figure holds this round thing. That's and with other round things, that's a fruit. It's a common way to depict a fruit basket in the Seljuk period. But if you would compare it like to Byzantine or Armenian or Georgian examples from where like the labors of the month probably were like introduced to Seljuk Anatolia, that specifically motif doesn't exist. So again, they made something new to represent the harvest, the seasons when you collect August or September. Here, just some images about animals. So they're real and non-real animals. Very commonly, we have composite animals, such as this incense burner, which looks a bit like a cat. We call it a stylized lion. And then you see the queue here ends in a head of a bird. We don't really know what kind of bird it is, but it's quite menacing because the way this sharp beak points towards the front, and then also you don't really see it, but here the teeth, they come down. It's a very frightening beast, and you have to imagine, so this was used to diffuse incense, so there would be a little, all these holes, from all these holes the incense would, and the smoke would come out and diffuse like a smell, like a nice smell. So it was meant to purify the space through the incense, but it was also a symbol of wealth, because incense and aromatics in that time were equal to like high value money, like gold and silver or diamonds or slaves. They were traded from one end to the other end of the Islamic world and beyond. And so to possess a piece like that, I mean, that was probably rather somebody wealthy. So here just another thing, so that was a door knocker with a lion head, and here facing heads of dragons. The lion always, many of these animals have like solar connotations, but the lion and also the double-headed eagles, those were symbols of power, and they were like you could associate them with the ruler. And so here it's actually interesting to see in this door knocker. So you have the head of the lion where the door knocker anchors and where it attaches to the door. So it's like the ruler, like the pillar of the world. And then you have these facing dragons around it. So he controls them. He controls the bad and the good dragon who face each other, and ensures that there was it's like a yin and yang. But so this is really interpretation. But what we know for sure is that this kind of door knocker, they were at the doors of mosques and madrasas, because very similar ones, they were still in situ in the late 19th and early 20th century. And we have similar imagery that is carved in stone or stucco on the buildings, on the entrance gates. And the common conclusion is that these were meant to protect the gates, what's inside. And so again, it's very interesting, because you have all these figural animals at the entrance of a mosque or at the entrance of a madrasa. That's a public, a religious building where, according like the common rules of Islamic art, you would not have figural imagery. But in the Seljuk period, that was the case. So double-headed eagles here in textile, in tile, ceramic, sphinxes and harpies, and many, many others. So I'm just rushing a little bit. So we're having two more sections. They're shorter. So we have many things are small size, except like, for example, this monumental wooden panel. We don't really know if it was a window shutter or if it was a door, but we know from which building it comes. Here, a larger tile panel that once decorated one of these openings in the Karatai Madrasa in Konya. So you get an idea. Actually, everything was covered by these tiles. And above, I mean, you don't see it now, but above is this beautiful dome, completely decorated with these turquoise and black tiles in a continuous and infinite star pattern, like interlacing stars, like very, very typical for Islamic art. And that developed in the Seljuk period. In this section 5, there will be emphasized on the educational part, the making and teaching of, making of books and the teaching through the books. So there is a nice little room devoted to the Qurans and other manuscripts from that period. And then, again, another particularity of that time, because of this multiple societies that were living together. I mentioned several times that led to these like really unusual creations. And there is one unusual creation similar to the motif of the labors of the months. Again, it appears in inlaid metalwork, where we have, so this horse rider, that's very Seljuk. Again, it relates to the chivalric tradition of the Seljuqs. They were nomads initially. Their life was happening on the back of their horse. They were eating kebab. I mean, there's actually poetry like that. They were eating kebab, drinking wine, and having fun all the time. They were warriors. So that's very typical. But then you have here this hooded figure here that relates actually to a Christian iconography. So on these inlaid brasses, there is a specific group of about 19 objects that exist today. So this is one of them that have this combination of the two, either standing saints, like images that relate to Christian iconography, but always together with like the Seljuk courtly cycle, the astrological symbols like here, or this hunter on the horseback. And then last section is on the funerary arts. So you'll see a selection of textiles that were excavated. Again, here this is just a fragment, but with this, it's a scene of an apotheosis, it says. I have to say, it's again an interpretation. I mean, other scholars relate this to the Ganymed story. It's not very clear. But what is interesting is actually the fact that there is this figural imagery on the textile, because we know it was meant to cover the body of a dead person. And again, according to Islamic law, and also if you read the medieval sources, you see that that's really a problematic thing to do. Your shroud should be blank and neutral, but the Seljuk world was different, and that's it's a fact because this was excavated. Then we have here furniture that comes from a tomb, and then more classical tombstones here in the shape of a prayer niche, very often with Quranic verses or with inscriptions giving the name of the deceased or the date when the person was inhumated. Okay, I made it in time. So this is the presentation. So I don't know, I'm sorry, I just flipped through these slides. I think we can go back to certain ones. And do we have time for a few questions?
We do, absolutely.
Good.
I have a question before we open it up to the floor, and that is, can you tell us what happened to the Seljuqs?
They're still alive.
They're still alive, yes, but I mean in terms of as a dynasty.
No, I'm not joking actually. I'm not joking because myself, I did my PhD on the Artukids, which is one of these branches, and there is still an Artukid family living in southeastern Turkey they live actually in a building that can be dated back to that period, and there is like a genealogy that goes back, so they're still alive. But they're not ruling anymore. What happened to the Seljuqs? What happened to the Mongols? At some point they lost their power and another dynasty took over, so that's very common in the time before the nations. Well, it still happens apparently, the nations' borders seem to be more decided. This is changing again. But in the medieval times, the borders were switching all the time. I think this is one of the characteristics, and that's what I try to emphasize on. It's not a unified empire. Really, the borders are moving all the time. That's also why sometimes it's difficult to present this material, because these different small dynasties and amirs, they were sometimes maybe ruling for the great Seljuks, but at the same time maybe for the rising Ayyubid dynasty. If you know names like Saladin, who is the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty. So that was all coexisting. But at some point, their power was deleted. Yeah.
Questions? Ingrid.
Could you please, hello?
It's being recorded, so just project.
Could you please speak more about this prohibition against representational art, which clearly wasn't in force in most of those images that you showed? So is this the exception, or was this a certain period during otherwise Islamic art throughout the centuries that adhered to this prohibition, or wasn't it a prohibition throughout most of the Middle Ages, and is this just a contemporary idea?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and it's actually one of the questions we usually emphasize on when we give our general tours in Islamic art. Actually, like in letters, there was no prohibition. I mean, not in the. I mean, in the Quran, there is no such things. In the Hadith, like in the Quran, there is only one passage that says you shouldn't adore idols, but it doesn't say. I mean, it's not very specific about you shouldn't represent figures. I mean, it's about the praying towards idols, the little figurines that the Prophet Muhammad encountered in the Kaaba in the very, very early period. However, in the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, that's what we call the hadith or the traditions, there are certain stories that kind of show that there is an ambiguity and a kind of, I wouldn't say a prohibition, but a negation, or like it shows it is problematic. Figural imagery is problematic. And actually in the laws, like the people who interpret the Quran and the Hadith, there it becomes more evident. However, even in the law, it depends in which period you are and in which region, that can change again. I think the example of the Seljuk period is a good example to show that this is really an exception, because the exceptional part is like you would not find it in the religious domain. You would never find in Islamic art, and that goes across the regions and across the chronology. There are several rules you can tell yourself. You never find figural imagery in a mosque or in a Quran. There is never a figural image. Or you wouldn't find it in the public sphere, because that again would create provocative reaction. However, and that again goes across the regions and the chronology, you always find figural imagery in the private sphere, in the palace, the art, the buildings, the manuscripts that were made for the rulers. And of course, that's maybe a bit confusing with this exhibition, because except the two last sections, which focus on the funerary arts and religion and teaching, everything is about the daily life, and many objects were meant for the ruling elite. So because it was Seljuk time, there was emphasis given on figural, but also because the way this exhibition is organized around the daily life and the palace and the court, there is a lot of figural. But if you would come to our galleries, you would find the figures even in different periods, but you would never find it in a mosque or a madrasa. And that's the case in the Seljuk time. You saw that door knocker, we know this was from a mosque or a madrasa. And that's exceptional. I mean, that's really not according those rules I would give you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else? Other questions? Yes, Shannon.
Thank you. I would love to hear more about the depiction of the rulers in Seljuk art, because you mentioned at the beginning that the art never depicted specific people, but there still are a lot of imageries of rulers and the symbolism of regarding ruling. And you mentioned that the ruler is the shadow of the God on earth, and I was curious to hear you more elaborate on that.
That's a very interesting question, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to answer in detail. First of all, even if let's say this print, this is what we call like a princely figure or standing figure. Or even if we would go, oh, this is different, but let's say this piece, even though it was not made in Seljuk lands, but it was meant for a Seljuk ruler. It's a depiction of Alexander the Great. He was Macedonian king. So the way the rulers in the Seljuk period were depicted, they were idealized. It was not really portraiture. It was more like the symbol of their power that was depicted, either through like this ancient hero, or here in the center, that's an eagle. We believe this was representing the ruler. We are not sure, but it was always a kind of a metaphor that would show the ruler in his glorious life, hunting, fighting, feasting, surrounded by the musicians, listening to poetry, but it was not really a portrait of the ruler. So it's actually his, how shall I say, the idea of a ruler that's depicted. And the interesting thing is, whereas these objects that are now just passed, I mean, here we know there is an inscription that gives the name of the ruler, so we know that person had this special need to like associate his name, eternalize it with this prestigious object. The same here, we have the whole name, it comes here around with all the titles. But then there are other objects. I'll show you. Like this bowl. Many of these Minae bowls, which again show a seated figure that presumably is an ideal ruler, or here people hunting and fighting, they were not produced for the rulers. This type of ceramic in Iran was produced for the middle class. There was a rising middle class population in Iran and Central Asia that wanted to have this prestigious ceramics, but it was not the ruling elite, because we don't really know what the ruling elite in the early Seljuk period in Iran, from what they were eating. We only know like silver bowls like this, but we know that all these ceramics, they were made for the middle class people. But so why do we have the ruler here again? This was fashion. This was fashion at the time because there was this idea that the ruler, he in the control of the power, he would protect everybody. He would ensure that there is a good life, prosperity, peace, and so on. So.
Other questions? Yes, Susan.
I was just thinking what a difficult time it would be for an oceanographer to be studying the ocean, and how difficult it must be for you studying this so much of this work which is being destroyed now. I wonder how much of the work that is being destroyed as libraries and museums are being pillaged is digitally recorded. And I just didn't know if you had any insights on your own feelings.
You mean about like Syria and Iraq? Digital, right. Yeah. It's a very good point you're making. I hope they will. The situation is that less for Syria, more for Iraq, like Mosul. Syria has been studied quite well. Mosul hasn't been studied at all, and it's now destructed. So it's very tricky. Myself, I'm specializing on that period. I can tell you for the Islamic period, we almost know nothing about Mosul, and it's very saddening and it's very frightening, because that means all the documentation, like many of these Syriac monasteries that have been bombed, well, those have been better studied, because thanks to the scholars and community who showed an interest toward those. But still, many things, they just got lost, and we don't know if there is documentation. However, because of this terrifying ongoing war, the nations and institutions and museums and universities and individuals, they have increased their efforts really significantly. Everybody, tries at least. I can tell you, like, coming from the Met, we also have, like, it's one of our focuses, but things go very slowly. There is always, like, you want to do a project, you want to digitize this site, but then maybe you don't have access to material. You need to first do some archive. You need to find the funding, somebody who helps you to arrange everything. It just takes time. It's very saddening, but this is the reality. But things are happening. So there are several digitization projects based in Berlin, people who are based now in Beirut or in Italy or in France, there is one project at the Columbia University, Mapping Mesopotamia, that's directed by Zeynep Bahrain. So things are happening. I just hope things will not be destroyed before you can really document. Like Mosul is the worst. Mosul is really very sad, yeah.
Yes.
And sorry, I forgot to say, one of the things we're trying to do in the exhibition is some of the objects where we know that they come from Mar Behnam or we also have an homage to the Aleppo minaret from the Great Mosque in Aleppo that was bombed. So we try actually to show certain pictures of these destroyed sites. The exhibition is also a homage to what's disappeared. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thanks again for a wonderful review. And I can imagine this work is very demanding because you're collecting all these materials from many different corners where they happen to be preserved. It's not like the materials, the territory is a vast, as you mentioned, that the exhibition's supposed to cover. Also, the chronological span is a broad one. And I have a question with regards to maybe selecting the criteria, so to speak. How do you collect? So the interesting aspect you mentioned from the 11th century on to 14th. Mm-hmm. And the 11th century, and you also mentioned the Seljuqs were the dynasties that brought actually Islam in most of these territories, mostly in the center of the oval we saw and towards the west, where obviously it's predominantly Christian, somewhat Jewish, and then you have the Crusades still going on, a very strong influence of the Byzantine Empire. If you go to the north, in Georgia in the 11th century, a large kingdom emerges by defending the Seljuqs, and throughout the 12th century it's mostly predominantly Christian, all the way from today's Sochi to today's Azerbaijan. So why, let's put it this way, to see these many different facets of styles and influences, wouldn't be it also interesting, and I understand this may be simply a question also of availability of resources, to see the interplay, to see the interaction or interplay between the different contexts that you would maybe, indeed you saw this wonderful piece of metal work where you see it's Alexander the Great and the iconography is pretty much more Christian than actually Islamic. So there are obvious double influences going back both ways, or multiple ways actually. So how did you come up with this idea to really focus mostly on Islamic?
The reason, you're perfectly right, and I can tell you in the process of making a large exhibition like this, you have to count about 5 years of thinking, maybe even more, of the day you have the idea and then it opens. Well, at the beginning, we had an idea to address those questions in one section, in the first section, to give an introduction to the arts of the Seljuk time, to introduce the history and the arts, the different medias, what kind of interaction could happen. But it was very clear from the beginning, because even to do that just in one section, it would not be enough. I'm sure there are many ways you could do this exhibition. Just at some point, we realized that this way the story hasn't been told yet. Because when you read in the books, if you go to books on Islamic art, it's true there is not a lot on this medieval period, but usually the way it's presented it's in this art historical approach, which I, as an art historian by formation, I prefer, because that's my foundation. I need this. I always, when I look at an artwork, I want to understand how was this made, and oh, that's actually not Seljuk, that's Byzantine, or is it maybe Georgian? Why is it all in this one bowl? However, it was a decision that was made, and I don't know. I mean, we are a team of 3 curators, so at some point this was decided, but we also realized that this way the story hasn't been told, because the amazing part of this material is the iconography. And so what we tried is, through these more iconographic themes, but within we always try to have this more art historical approach. And so there is, for example, a section just on ceramics, which I haven't emphasized now because you see I used all my time and I have 50 slides. But like we try in individual objects, there we try to focus and say, I don't know, like this inlaid metalwork with Christian iconography. Why was this created? What was the context, the Crusader context, and so on. I don't really know if for the public it's going to be easy to understand. I hope that the way we're telling our story is clear, but this was a decision. So to emphasize more on how these objects were used, what they meant to the people, and yeah, but you're right. If you have different ideas, we can talk about it.
Can you go back to the slide of the brass box with the silver inlay? Towards the end?
The Christian metalwork? Or which?
Towards the end.
Okay. This one, right?
Yeah. So it looks, excuse me, it looks a lot, the 2 figures on the horses, it looks a lot like a ceramic bowl that you have at the Met in the Islamic wing of Mohammed on the horse. And I noticed that both of these figures have halos.
Yeah.
So can you explain that?
Okay, well, the appearance of halos in medieval Islamic art is very common. It is because of the influence of Christian miniature painting. Basically, also other media, but that's our understanding. However, the way it's used in Islamic art, like in this, it's not religious. All the figures, like even a doctor, a woman, like who is bitten by a snake in the bazaar, they have halos. It has nothing to do with the holiness. The holiness, however, in this piece, I mean, I've discussed this with a curator in the Department of Medieval Art. We had some ideas about, because you see this figure here, this hooded figure, I mean, there is another figure very similar but holding the hands on the back, and here you have the cross, and this is like a book stand. So this is refers to the Passion. I mean, when Jesus on the cross. And because he's hooded, and the other figure who is hooded, that's like a position of Maria, like praying, orante. In the context of this, and also with here, 1, 2, 3, it looks like roundels, but we believe now that's the Trinity, like God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. In that specific context, you could maybe see these ruling figures on the horse. I don't like King David, but this is really hypothesis. Like this is now out of my field of expertise. So you could go in that direction, but I really in general, I would stay away. Like the halo, the figures with a halo in Islamic art, every figure has it. The only time when it becomes really sacred, when there is a sacred figure that's depicted like the Prophet Muhammad, and that you see in later manuscript painting, like from, I don't know, your example was probably 15th, 16th century, the halo becomes different. It's like a flame. It's something different. It's actually not a halo. So I don't know which image or which bowl you're referring to. So if you can show me the image, it'll be easier.
The figure on the horse looks so similar to the figure of Muhammad. I wondered how you ruled out that it was not Mohammed, but a
Well,
Seljuk.
first of all, I think your image cannot, I mean, has to be, it's post-Seljuk because we don't have depictions of Muhammad from the Seljuk time. So you're saying a bowl. I wonder if it's not a miniature, a manuscript painting.
It's about this big. It's in the Met, in the Islamic wing.
But is it a ceramic figure? What is it exactly?
It's a ceramic bowl.
I don't think that's Muhammad. That's impossible
Well,
because
that
we
was
don't
what
have.
the label said.
Yeah,
I'll have to look
I
up
don't
the
know.
image.
If
I'll
I
look it
see
up.
the image, I could be more specific.
Yeah.
But from this time, there are no depictions of the Muhammad. They begin in manuscript paintings in the 14th, 15th century. That's after the
Deniz,
Seljuks.
can I say something? It's been interesting for me because this last year I've really been working at the Met and studying the collection, and I've come to the conclusion that the most common image in the collection of the museum is a figure on horseback.
Yeah, it's because of the Seljuks. Because
Other questions? Yes.
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 Thank you for showing this amazing craftsmanship and these amazing skills of this craftsman. Do we know how they were trained?
Well, we don't really know because we don't have books or texts to talk about them. We have a few texts that mention, for example, the ceramists. We know that the family that was making the pottery in Kashan, I mean, I'm calling this pottery, I mean this luxurious Minai and lusterware ceramics, this was a family business. So it was basically like the son would inherit it from the father and it would go on. Other than that, we have inscriptions on certain objects, like on the famous Glockensewer from the British Museum, that gives the name of the person. And specifically in this type of metalwork, I mean, many of these, they are tied to the school of Al-Mawsuli, like from Mosul. They always sign their pieces with, I don't know, Abdul Rahman Al-Mawsuli from Mosul. However, we don't know if they really were making these in Mosul or somewhere else, because we have then other pieces that mention this was made in Yemen or in Damascus, but it's still same with the same like signature Al-Mawsuli from Mosul. So even there we're not clear about if this was a family workshop, if this was a city-based workshop, and how this really functions. Sometimes we have inscriptions where the artist or the craftsman, the notion of artist did not really exist. It was really more a craftsmanship. But we have inscriptions where the person would say, I don't know, I'm making it up, Abdul Rahman, pupil of Ibn Shuja. And then everybody knows, okay, so this was the master, he was working in his workshop. That's all. I mean, other than that, they were starting very young. If you have the chance to go, I mean, now Aleppo you can't, but maybe in Fez, where like handicraft is revived and developed, I mean, or you can see like jewelry workshops. I've been interviewing jewelers who would make filigrane work in southeastern Turkey. If they don't start like at the age of 5 or 6, 7 years, they won't have the skills to make the nice jewelry when they get at the age, like adult age. So they have to start very young. And of course in that time there was no adult young, that was like, life was shorter. Yeah, I think it's experience and training by doing.
Yeah, experience, but also the fact that, I mean, they need, even with the experience, you don't make this amazing ceramic at the age of 30 or 40. You need some kind
a master.
Of traditions.
Of course, you need a master, but we also have to understand that the notion, like our notion of time, like if I show you an artwork, like I have no idea how much time they needed to do it. I have a better idea for a building because there are sometimes inscriptions where I can like make the chronology of the piece, but we don't really have studies who would tell us like how much time was needed to do it. I mean, how difficult this craft actually was for them, because to me it looks amazing. I learned from like ceramists, like contemporary ceramists, that and that I know from myself, this type of like mosaic cut tile work, it's very elaborate. It takes a lot of time. We know still like craftsmen working in Fez who continue this technique. It takes a lot of time, but they have a certain routine, a certain systematic of doing it, so it gets more like, not industrial, but it's more like serious production, because they have the know-how, like, but I agree. Something like this, I don't know. This is.
It's the blue vase that you showed at the
yes.
very beginning.
Well, the glass, we have
amazing.
better ideas because there's still like recently I met somebody who works in Damascus in a workshop.
The plate, the blue plate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, the ceramic plate.
Yeah.
That, you know what? This
yeah,
one? This one, yeah. Because most of these pieces were made with mold. What happened in the Seljuk time, so actually that material, what we call the stone paste, actually, so this is the clue of the story. They tried to get to know how to do porcelain. So from the beginning of Islamic art, like everybody was like dying to get the knowledge to do porcelain. And actually what happened, that's why they started, so they used, so stone paste has this fritter, like has glass inside actually. It's like crunched, I don't know how you call it in English, silicon, yes. Which makes the body, like the earthenware, it makes it much harder. It's actually more difficult to model it. It's not that easy than with earthenware. However, what's better than to do it, that you can have very fine shapes and you can mold them. So they were starting to make molds. Many of these shapes were made with molds. And this is actually a shape that's known from Chinese porcelain, but they painted it with cobalt blue. That's like the Islamic thing. And then also they did much more decoration applied. They applied much more decoration. But that was not that difficult. There was a specific technology because they were already, since 200 years, they were working on it. This is not something that was just created in 1 year. That was a process of searching for the material to figure out how can I make porcelain. And while doing this, they didn't really find the technique to do the porcelain, but they find something else. They find this kind of amazing stone paste, which then they would make molds and all kind of forms, and they would apply relief decoration. They would put their hunting rulers and musicians, dancing figures in high relief, all kind of things, which you don't have in Chinese ceramics. So that motivated them, the Chinese porcelain and the Chinese like ceramic ware, but it led to something completely different.
We have time for one more question.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm interested in the origins of the Seljuqs because I remember earlier you said that they were nomads, and I realized, and I kind of made the connection that a lot of the technical aspects of Seljuk art kind of reminds me of Uyghur art. So,
I didn't understand that last part.
Uyghur art.
I can't hear you.
Uyghur, it's an ethnic minority in China.
Ah.
And it's very much...
Uyghur. Uyghur?
Yeah, in
You
East
Turkmenistan.
Turkmenistan.
Okay, yes. Those are also Turks. I don't know if the Uyghurs, if they would come from the same tribe, because the Seljuks, they come from the Döer tribe. The only thing we know about the Seljuks and all of these Turkish dynasties that were rising with the Seljuks, it's very legendary. It's actually very interesting. In my PhD, so I was focused on the Artukits, and so I was reading the foundation of the dynasty, the first Artukit, and I don't know, suddenly he was there. And he was son of Artuk, bilmem ne except from the Dör tribe of the Seljuqs, but somewhere our historic records, they don't really tell us, they don't shed light on what's happening. The only thing which we can tell is that at some point in the Uyghur, like in the Altai Mountains, like in that northern part of Central Asia that's now in Russia, at some point what happened is there was like a real need to migrate. And that Dör tribe and the Seljuqs, like those who like founded the Seljuk dynasty, those would migrate to south. Apparently we think because of climate condition, because they were nomads, so their daily life was based on like pasturage, how do you say in English? Like pastoral. So their horse, the sheep, they needed food, and that's why they were moving. So they had like a specific like pastoral pattern, and for some reasons we don't know. We think it was a climate reason that they had to change their pastoral route, and they migrated south into Central Asia, into what's now Turkmenistan, and I don't know, one of them fighted with the others, got successful, and they built an empire. They were first two brothers, and then it expanded.
Deniz, thank you so much. Let's give her a big round of applause. Thank you everyone for attending. Hello everyone, welcome to the School of Visual Arts. We're very fortunate this evening to have Professor Deniz Beyazit with us, and I'm going to read a little bit about Deniz because her credentials are quite wonderful and very impressive. Dr. Deniz Beyazit is Assistant Curator in the Department of Islamic Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, where she specializes in medieval Islamic and Ottoman art and architecture. A graduate of the Sorbonne, she has been a research associate at both the Museum Reitberg in Zurich and the French Institute for Anatolian Studies in Istanbul, as well as the Kahlili Research Center in Oxford. She has taught at the University of Zurich and since 2005 has been involved in cultural heritage and restoration projects in southeastern Turkey. Dr. Beyazit is the editor of At the Crossroads of Empires, 14th through 15th century Eastern Anatolia, Dibukart 2012 publishers, and the publication of her dissertation on Artikid architectural decoration of the 12th through the 15th century in southeast Turkey is forthcoming from the British Archaeological Reports of Oxford. Her current research focuses on medieval palaces of the Jazeera and depictions of Mecca in Ottoman art. At the Metropolitan, where she has worked since 2010, Dr. Beyazit helped with the expansion and restructuring project of the Galleries for Islamic Art, which reopened in 2011. Among her many projects, she organized the exhibitions The Making of a Collection, Islamic Art at the Met, that was in 2011-2012, and Carpets of the East and Paintings from the West, 2014 at the Met, and 2015 at the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. Together with her colleagues Sheila Canby and Martina Rujadi, she is preparing the exhibition and accompanying publication, Court and Cosmos, The Great Age of the Seljuqs, which is to open on the 27th of April of this year. Please join me in giving Deniz a very warm welcome to the School of Visual Arts. Thank you, Deniz.
Well, thank you, Peter, for introducing me, and thank you overall for inviting me to give this talk, which I hope will raise some interest on medieval Islamic art. And I'm very grateful to the School of Visual Arts, and particularly to Tom Hahn, I hope I pronounced correctly, as well as to Justin Elm, who helped with to set up the PowerPoint presentation. So what I brought you today is a selection of images of very beautiful artworks which at the beginning of April will all arrive individually to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and will be installed then in the exhibition, the special exhibition gallery, which we call the Cantor Gallery. And after 4 weeks of busy installation, the exhibition will open to the public on April 27. So before I start with the slides, just want to give a few introductory remarks on that period about which we will be talking and about which these artworks will illustrate, like the magnificence of culture, of art, of craftsmanship in the regions of Iran, Central Asia, Anatolia, and also a bit Syria and Iraq. Chronologically, we are talking about a period that goes from the early 11th to the late, or I would say to the early 14th century. And in certain areas, we would even go to the very end of the 14th century. So it's quite a large stretch in geography, and as well as in chronology. We're covering almost 300 years, and a distance that goes from Merv, that's today in Turkmenistan, to Isfahan in Iran, to places such as Mosul, Damascus, Aleppo, which you may know now because of the sad news of the ongoing war in the Near East. And then further north and further west to Anatolia, to cities like Konya, Erzurum, Sivas, and other places. So it's quite a broad, thematically very broad, and the material is very rich. So there are several ways to present the material to the public, not only to the public, but as you know, at the Met, we always try to have a scholarly approach and also present the material to the scholars. So it's not a typical art historical exhibition. We could have divided this in periods and say, let's do first Iran, Central Asia, and then move chronologically forward to Syria, Iraq, and Anatolia, which is now to Turkey. So instead of doing that classical approach, we did a more script. And that script particularly developed on metalwork pieces like this one, only on metalwork pieces, and it's characteristic for the Seljuk period. Here, just to see an image of how minai looks. So that's one of the ceramics inventions. And then, of course, there was an increased activity in building and construction. And it is true that in Iran and Central Asia, where the main material was more perishable, let's say what they were using was brick and less stone, this leads to an impression that in Anatolia or Syria or Iraq, much more survived or more was constructed, but it's actually wrong. It's just a wrong impression. So here, can I go? Yeah. So that's one of the famous buildings in Anatolia, in Turkey. It's a so-called complex, a madrasa that also served as a hospital, and it's it's a UNESCO World Heritage Monument and site, and it's just, amazing. The carved decoration that you can see here on one of the portals, I can say it's unique, but actually it's not that unique, because when you look around, then you discover more, but this is really one of the most prestigious ones. Well, so I mentioned the exhibition space, so that's how the current design looks like. I can tell you it's still work in progress. We just decided on the colors, but just to give you an idea of the scale of the space and how it's organized. So the designer decided to use the plan of a medieval Seljuk mosque, which characteristically has columns. So we have these columns here Some of them belong to the building of the Met, so you can't move them. And usually there are like walls that are built around and to separate the different spaces in an exhibition. But so this time the designer decided to keep them and actually to add more columns and to give the impression of a forest of columns. And that's something that you sometimes encounter when you go to a mosque, to a great mosque in Iran or in Turkey. It's this idea of having a hippo-style room. And so the exhibition is built around, decided to do something different, to have themes that highlight aspects of the daily life of these people. Of course, many of the artworks rather come from a courtly context or are believed to be made for wealthier people, but still there is also some popular material. And so the idea was to reflect, to try to tell the story of the life at the court, the life in the streets, etc. So So just to give you an idea about the region we're talking about. So I'm sorry, this is a scan of the catalog that just has finished with printing and binding. And so you see the density of the places, of the cities from that time in those areas. We have talking about Anatolia, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and then further we're going until Afghanistan. That was also part of the great Seljuk world. So we're really in one of the most glorious periods. It's for Iran and for Anatolia, it's one of the golden ages. I mean, myself being from Turkey, I can tell you even if I talk to somebody in the street, everybody will know about the Seljuks. Completely different here. If I go in the street and say, well, I'm doing an exhibition on the Seljuks, nobody will understand. But in Turkey or in Iran, everybody will know because it's the glory of the past. For Turkey, it's a time when the Turkish culture was introduced to the lands, to the Anatolian lands, which in our days correspond more or less to the Republic of Turkey. And so that's why. It's very simple. Well, just to show you some images about the material. So there was clearly an economic boom in Iran and also in Central Asia after the beginning of the Seljuk rule. And the result was, of course, an increase in craftsmanship, but also like existing techniques such as brass that was inlaid, a technique that was known already since ancient times. They tested, and the aim was really to have much more sophisticated artworks, which led to things like this famous Block-Azure that will be traveling from the British Museum in London. There were also new inventions and new techniques in ceramics. New shapes were created, and specifically there was a new material, stone paste material, that was much harder and on which they tried relief decoration, and shapes from China and Central Asia were imitated. And then also they invented new glazes. So there are two very important new glazes that are known for the Islamic world in general. One is luster ceramics and the other is Minai ceramics, which is very colorful. Minai is, we call it also like the technique of the 7 colors. It's a bit like painting, very colorful, and it's actually very difficult to produce on the body of stone paste or of ceramics because it has to go several times in the oven and it's very delicate, so the risk that it breaks is very high. But so those techniques, they developed and flourished under the Seljuks, first in Iran. There was one very important ceramic center in Kashan, and from there the technique spread to Syria, Iraq, and also Anatolia. Then, of course, manuscripts. Manuscripts were considered as luxurious products in the medieval period, and one has to understand that there was an increase of paper production that started already in the 8th, 9th century in the Islamic world, but it was specifically under the Seljuqs in the 10th, 11th century that paper became really very popular, which led to a much larger production of manuscripts that were used to write down the Quran, the holy word of God, that would be lavishly not illustrated, like decorated with gold paint, very fine arabesque decoration. There was also a development in different styles of script. So that's another like section that is characteristic for Islamic art. And again, it's in the Seljuk time that the script kind of received a special focus or emphasis. There was a very geometric script that received floral decoration, and all kind of styles developed. There is even a script that has ends of letters with animals or human heads. We call it the